The victories at Trenton and Princeton gave the Continental Army something it desperately needed: time. Time to reorganize, time to recruit, and time to rebuild morale. Washington used the winter months that followed to stabilize his forces and plan for the challenges ahead. Although the army remained small and undersupplied, its spirit had been transformed. Soldiers who had once considered desertion now re-enlisted. Civilians who had doubted the revolution now offered renewed support, but the British were far from defeated. London responded to the setbacks in New Jersey with a bold new strategy for 1777. Their goal was to split the colonies in two by seizing control of the Hudson River Valley. If they could isolate New England, the heart of revolutionary resistance, they believed the southern and middle colonies would collapse more easily. The plan involved a multi-pronged invasion aimed at cutting off communication, trade, and military coordination. General John Burgoyne was chosen to lead the northern offensive. A confident and charismatic officer, Burgoyne devised an ambitious campaign. He would march south from Canada with a large force, capturing forts along the way and securing the vital water routes that connected the interior of North America. Meanwhile, another British force would move northward from New York City, and ideally a third would advance from the west. The three armies would converge in Albany, completing the encirclement of New England. On paper, the plan seemed sound. Britain had superior numbers, better training, and control of key supply lines. But the strategy depended on flawless coordination over vast distances and rugged terrain. It also underestimated American resilience and the determination of local militias to defend their territory. As Burgoyne marched south, he quickly encountered unexpected challenges. Dense forests, swamps, and narrow pathways slowed his army. Long supply lines became vulnerable to American raids. Furthermore, the British assumed that loyalists in the region would rise up to support them. But loyalist numbers were smaller than expected, and many feared retaliation if they openly aided the British. Burgoyne's force moved steadily, but the journey was far more difficult than he had anticipated. While Burgoyne pushed south, General William Howe, commanding British forces in New York City, made a critical decision. Instead of marching north to join Burgoyne, Howe chose to launch a separate campaign to capture Philadelphia, the political center of the Revolution. This choice confused British planners and ultimately doomed the larger strategy. Without Howe's support, Burgoyne's army was isolated deep in hostile territory. Meanwhile, American forces under General Philip Schuyler, and later General Horatio Gates, began fortifying positions along the Hudson Valley. Militia units from New York, New England, and even distant states responded to the threat by joining the defensive effort. Farmers left their fields, tradesmen left their shops, and communities united to protect their land. Burgoyne had expected an easy march. Instead, he found himself surrounded by a growing ring of resistance. At the same time, Washington faced challenges of his own. His army shadowed Howe's movements but could not prevent the British from capturing Philadelphia in September 1777. The loss of the city was a heavy blow. Congress was forced to flee, and critics again questioned Washington's leadership. Yet Washington understood that the war could not be won by defending every city. The true measure of success was preserving the army and wearing down the British through sustained resistance. As Howe settled into winter quarters in Philadelphia, Washington made a fateful decision to encamp at Valley Forge. The encampment would become a symbol of hardship, sacrifice, and perseverance. But in the late months of 1777, its future significance was not yet apparent. What mattered most at that moment was events unfolding far to the north. In September and October, Burgoyne's army clashed with American forces in a series of battles near Saratoga. These engagements, though not the final collapse of the British campaign, demonstrated that Burgoyne was losing ground. American forces had grown more organized, more confident, and more willing to stand their ground. The militias, often underestimated by British commanders, played a crucial role by harassing supply lines, cutting off reinforcements, and surrounding British positions. The conflict in the Hudson Valley revealed a deeper truth about the American Revolution. The war was not simply a contest of professional armies. It was a people's war. Local communities shaped the outcome as much as generals and diplomats. Their knowledge of the land, their motivation to defend their homes, and their willingness to endure hardships gave the Americans an advantage that British commanders failed to appreciate. By late 1777, the revolution stood at a pivotal moment. Washington's army had lost Philadelphia but remained intact. Burgoyne's invasion was faltering. The British government still hoped to crush the rebellion, but the colonies had shown an extraordinary capacity for survival. And the world, especially France, was watching closely. The next major event would change the course of the war, not just for America, but for global politics. The fate of the revolution and the reasons behind it would soon take on international significance. The surrender of British General John Burgoyne at Saratoga in October 1777 marked a turning point in the American Revolution. After months of marching through dense forests, facing harassment from militias and enduring supply shortages, Burgoyne's army was surrounded near Saratoga, New York, facing overwhelming odds and dwindling provisions. He surrendered more than 5,000 troops to American forces under General Horatio Gates. This victory was more than a military triumph. It was a validation of the revolutionary cause. Saratoga demonstrated that the Continental Army, combined with determined militias, could defeat a professional British army. The win boosted American morale and convinced colonists that independence was achievable. More importantly, it sent a powerful message to the world. The American Revolution was not a fleeting rebellion but a serious, organized, and capable movement. European powers, particularly France, took notice. France had been observing the revolution carefully. Since the loss of its North American territories in the 7 Years' War, France sought revenge against Britain. Yet French leaders were cautious, unwilling to commit military support until the American cause proved viable. The victory at Saratoga provided the evidence they needed. American forces had won a major engagement without significant foreign intervention, showing that the colonies could hold their own. This emboldened France to act. Negotiations with France, which had been underway in secret, accelerated. Diplomats like Benjamin Franklin leveraged Saratoga to secure formal recognition and military assistance. France agreed to provide loans, troops, and naval support, transforming the war from a local rebellion into an international conflict. This alliance gave the Americans access to vital resources, opened new fronts against Britain, and increased pressure on the British government. The revolution, once primarily a North American struggle, had now become a global contest. The French alliance also inspired other nations. Spain and the Dutch Republic observed France's commitment and began offering support indirectly, whether through loans, supplies, or strategic coordination. This widening of the conflict forced Britain to divert troops and attention, further relieving pressure on American forces. The revolution was no longer an isolated colonial war. It was now a complex, international struggle with far-reaching consequences. Saratoga also transformed domestic American politics. Confidence in Washington and his army increased, and Congress gained legitimacy for its efforts in maintaining unity among the states. Patriots who had questioned the feasibility of independence now believed victory was possible. Ordinary citizens, inspired by news of the triumph, contributed more actively to the war effort. Militias grew stronger, and supply chains improved as local communities recognized the importance of sustained support. Yet even after this turning point, challenges remained. Washington's army still faced shortages, harsh winters, and British forces in key cities such as New York and Philadelphia. Loyalist sentiment persisted in parts of the southern colonies, threatening internal stability. Coordination among the 13 states remained a constant struggle, as each state had its own priorities and resources. The victory at Saratoga was decisive, but it did not guarantee ultimate success. The psychological impact of Saratoga, however, was immense. Colonists now had tangible proof that they could resist and even defeat the British. Soldiers gained renewed courage, civilians became more engaged in sustaining the war effort, and foreign powers viewed the revolution as legitimate. The momentum shifted decisively in favor of the Americans, setting the stage for the years of conflict that would follow. Saratoga also reinforced the principles that had motivated the revolution from the beginning. Americans fought not only to repel British armies but to defend their rights, establish self-governance, and create a society based on liberty. Each victory, each hardship endured, confirmed that the struggle was about more than territory. It was about the kind of nation the colonies wanted to become. The revolution was now inseparable from the ideals that had inspired it. As the war moved forward, the lessons of Saratoga guided both military strategy and political planning. Americans realized that collaboration, persistence, and leveraging local advantages could overcome the apparent superiority of the British. Victory was not guaranteed by brute force alone. It required coordination, innovation, and an unyielding commitment to principles. This understanding shaped the Revolutionary War and defined the emerging American identity. The world was watching. The revolution had transformed from a regional conflict into a test of ideas: liberty versus empire, self-governance versus distant authority. The outcome would. The winter of 1777 to 1778 presented a new set of challenges for the Continental Army, even after the victories at Trenton, Princeton, and Saratoga. George Washington chose to encamp at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, a location that offered strategic advantages but also harsh conditions. The army faced freezing temperatures, insufficient clothing, limited food, and rampant disease. Morale was low, and Congress struggled to provide the necessary support. Yet Valley Forge became a crucible in which the character and resilience of the Revolutionary Army were tested and forged. During this difficult period, Washington's leadership proved crucial. He maintained strict discipline while demonstrating personal courage and concern for his soldiers. He walked among the tents, checked on the sick, and encouraged men to persevere despite the suffering. Washington's presence reassured the army that their struggle had purpose, even when circumstances seemed bleak. Valley Forge also became a turning point in military training. Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer with experience in European armies, arrived to assist the Continental Army. Steuben introduced rigorous drills, standardized procedures, and modern techniques for infantry maneuvers. Under his guidance, soldiers learned to operate cohesively as a professional fighting force. The training transformed the army, turning a ragged militia into an organized, disciplined force capable of standing against British regulars. The improvements at Valley Forge had immediate and long-term consequences. In the spring of 1778, the Continental Army emerged stronger, better trained, and more confident. Soldiers understood the importance of coordination, communication, and strategy. The winter hardships had forged unity, loyalty, and resilience, qualities essential for facing the next phase of the war. Meanwhile, the international dimension of the revolution grew. France officially entered the war in early 1778, forming a military alliance with the United States. French troops, naval forces, and financial support bolstered the American cause. The alliance changed the strategic calculus. Britain now faced the possibility of a global war, stretching its resources across multiple continents. France's involvement also lent legitimacy to the American Revolution, signaling to other nations that the struggle was serious and potentially successful. The presence of French allies had both military and psychological effects. American soldiers gained confidence knowing they were no longer alone. British commanders were forced to divide their attention and resources, weakening their campaigns in North America. The alliance also provided opportunities for coordinated operations such as the eventual siege of Yorktown, where combined American and French forces would deliver a decisive blow to British power. At home, the revolution continued to reshape society. Civilians faced shortages, inflation, and uncertainty, yet they also experienced a growing sense of participation in their nation's fate. Local governments became more efficient at collecting supplies, raising militias, and maintaining order. Women played vital roles in sustaining households, managing businesses, and supporting the war effort. The revolution extended beyond the battlefield, touching every aspect of colonial life and reinforcing the notion that independence required collective effort. The ideological foundations of the revolution remained as important as military victories. The principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence, natural rights, self-governance, and liberty continued to guide political decisions and unify the colonies. Patriots emphasized that the struggle was not only about defeating British armies but about creating a new society based on these ideals. This ideological coherence distinguished the American Revolution from other conflicts of the era and helped maintain commitment even during periods of adversity. As spring arrived, Washington prepared to take advantage of the army's renewed strength. The British, still occupying Philadelphia, had overextended their supply lines and faced increasing harassment from local militias. Washington and his generals recognized opportunities to challenge the enemy strategically, rather than seeking decisive battles alone. The combination of trained soldiers, inspired civilians, and French support created conditions for a new phase of the revolution, one in which the outcome, while still uncertain, appeared increasingly attainable. Valley Forge, despite its suffering, proved that the revolution was more than a series of battles or protests. It was a test of endurance, leadership, and national spirit. The ability of the Continental Army to survive, adapt, and emerge stronger reflected the broader strength of the American cause. The revolution had matured, transforming from a loose coalition of colonies into a united front, capable of confronting one of the world's most powerful empires. In retrospect, Valley Forge became a symbol of perseverance. It illustrated that independence would not be won solely through courage or ideology, but through resilience, organization, and sacrifice. The lessons learned there would guide Washington, his army, and the nation through the remaining years of the struggle for freedom. The spring of 1778 marked the beginning of a new strategic phase in the American Revolution. With the Continental Army trained and reorganized after the hardships of Valley Forge, George Washington was no longer simply trying to survive. He could take initiative. The arrival of French forces added a critical advantage. French ships patrolled the coast, preventing British reinforcements from easily reaching the colonies, while French soldiers provided experienced manpower for future campaigns. The revolution had transformed from a defensive struggle into a coordinated effort to challenge British power directly. Washington understood that maintaining public support was as important as winning battles. Civilians were crucial to the war effort, providing food, supplies, and intelligence. Patriot leaders communicated constantly through newspapers, pamphlets, and letters, reinforcing the ideological purpose of the struggle. The message was clear. Independence was not just a military necessity, it was a moral and political imperative, rooted in principles that transcended immediate hardship. Meanwhile, the British faced increasing difficulties. The loss of Saratoga, combined with the new French alliance, forced London to reconsider its strategy. Troops were stretched thin across North America, Europe, and the Caribbean. British generals, accustomed to rapid victories, struggled to adapt to a protracted, unconventional conflict. Supply lines became vulnerable to American raids, and local militias continued to challenge control over rural areas. Britain had underestimated the colonies' determination and the resilience of their people. The war also exposed deeper social and political changes within the colonies. Local governments and committees became more sophisticated, coordinating logistics, recruitment, and governance. Communities organized militias, tracked loyalist activity, and enforced the revolutionary cause at a local level. Ordinary citizens, from farmers to tradespeople, realized that their participation was essential for independence. The revolution had shifted from being a conflict between elites to a broad-based struggle involving nearly every layer of society. Women, too, played a critical role. With men away at war, they managed farms, businesses, and households, ensuring that communities remained functional. Many acted as nurses, spies, and couriers, directly supporting the Continental Army. Their contributions were indispensable, demonstrating that the fight for independence extended beyond the battlefield. The revolution, in many ways, redefined social roles and expectations, leaving lasting changes in American society. Even as the colonies strengthened internally, challenges remained. Loyalist opposition continued in pockets of the southern colonies and along major cities. Native American nations, facing encroachment and conflict, aligned with Britain in some cases, creating additional complications. Enslaved Africans sought freedom by joining either side depending on who offered opportunity, highlighting the contradictions inherent in a fight for liberty within a society dependent on slavery. These complexities added layers of difficulty to the revolutionary struggle. The war's international dimension grew more pronounced as France and, later, Spain committed support. French financial and military assistance allowed the Americans to purchase supplies, train soldiers, and mount more ambitious operations. French involvement also demonstrated, too. Britain that the rebellion was not a minor disturbance, it was a threat that required global attention. The Revolutionary War, initially a colonial rebellion, had become part of a larger contest among European powers for influence and supremacy. Within this context, Washington's strategic approach emphasized patience, resilience, and selective engagement. He avoided direct confrontations with larger British forces unless conditions were favorable. Instead, he relied on mobility, intelligence, and coordination with local militias to harass enemy lines, disrupt supply routes, and protect key territories. This strategy frustrated British commanders who expected traditional battles, and it showcased the adaptability of the American forces. The ideological message of the revolution remained central. Americans framed the conflict as a struggle for natural rights, self-governance, and independence from oppressive authority. This message reinforced unity and provided motivation during the most challenging times. Soldiers and civilians alike understood that their sacrifices were part of a larger vision, one that aimed not merely to defeat British troops, but to create a nation grounded in liberty, law, and civic responsibility. By 1778, the revolution had matured. The colonies were no longer a loosely organized rebellion but a coordinated movement capable of sustaining military, political, and diplomatic efforts simultaneously. Despite hardships, defeats, and uncertainty, the American cause had gained credibility at home and abroad. The successes and lessons of the past 2 years, Valley Forge, Saratoga, Trenton, and Princeton demonstrated that perseverance, strategy, and principle could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The stage was now set for further military campaigns, strengthened alliances, and political consolidation. The American Revolution had evolved from scattered protests against taxation and regulation into a determined, resilient fight for independence, international recognition, and the creation of a new nation. By 1779, the American Revolution had entered a critical phase, with both military and political dimensions expanding. The successes of previous years, especially at Saratoga, had bolstered the colony's confidence, and the alliance with France had transformed the struggle into a global conflict. Yet the war remained far from won. British forces still occupied key cities, controlled vital ports, and possessed overwhelming naval power. The challenge now was to maintain momentum while expanding the revolution beyond the northern colonies. The southern colonies became a new focus for both sides. Britain hoped to exploit Loyalist support in Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina to regain control and isolate New England. This strategy reflected an understanding that American unity was fragile and that regional divisions could be exploited. Loyalists in the South were numerous, well-organized, and motivated by fear of revolutionary reprisals or hope for stability under British rule. American commanders, aware of these dangers, adapted by combining Continental Army units with local militias. Leaders such as Nathaniel Greene, Francis Marion, and Daniel Morgan emphasized mobility, intelligence, and the use of guerrilla tactics. These strategies contrasted with traditional European-style warfare but proved highly effective in the southern terrain. American forces avoided direct confrontations when disadvantageous and instead harassed British supply lines, disrupted communications, and gradually weakened enemy positions. The war in the South illustrated an essential lesson of the Revolution. Success depended not only on formal battles but on the support and engagement of local populations. Communities that supplied intelligence, food, and shelter to American forces contributed directly to military outcomes. Likewise, Loyalist opposition demonstrated that political divisions could influence the course of campaigns as much as battlefield skill. The Revolution was, in many ways, a struggle for hearts and minds as well as for territory. International dynamics continued to influence the war. France, committed to the American cause, increased its military and naval presence. French commanders coordinated with Washington and other American leaders to plan operations that would stretch British resources. Spain, motivated by its rivalry with Britain, provided support in the form of loans, troops, and pressure along British holdings in the Gulf Coast. The involvement of these European powers elevated the conflict from a colonial rebellion to a complex international war, forcing Britain to fight on multiple fronts. The alliance also affected morale. American soldiers and civilians drew confidence from the knowledge that powerful nations had vested interests in their success. It was no longer just 13 colonies against Britain. It was a coalition capable of challenging the empire globally. This perception strengthened the resolve of soldiers at the front and communities supporting the revolution at home. At the same time, the ideological foundation of the revolution remained central. Leaders continued to frame the struggle as a fight for natural rights, self-governance, and freedom from tyranny. Pamphlets, speeches, and newspapers emphasized that every sacrifice contributed to the creation of a nation based on these principles. Ordinary citizens facing shortages, displacement, and danger understood that their hardships were part of a larger historical purpose. Economic pressures persisted. Inflation, scarcity of goods, and disruption of trade challenged both military operations and civilian life. Yet these difficulties also fostered innovation. Americans developed local manufacturing, organized supply networks, and coordinated fundraising efforts to support the army. Communities adapted to shortages by sharing resources and maintaining local production. These efforts reinforced a sense of collective responsibility. Crucial to sustaining the revolution, the war also highlighted contradictions within the new nation. The fight for liberty coexisted with the reality of slavery, the displacement of Native Americans, and social hierarchies that limited political participation for women and poorer citizens. These tensions did not halt the revolution, but they underscored the complexity of building a society based on freedom while grappling with entrenched social structures. The ideals of the revolution were aspirational, motivating debate and gradual reform even amid ongoing conflict. By the end of 1779, the American Revolution had evolved significantly. It was no longer a series of protests or scattered military engagements. It was a coordinated, multifaceted struggle that combined military strategy, political organization, ideological messaging, and international diplomacy. Success required leadership, perseverance, and the active participation of soldiers and civilians alike. The revolution had matured, proving that the colonies could sustain a fight against one of the most powerful empires in the world. Looking forward, the coming years would demand even greater coordination, sacrifice, and innovation. The war would extend into new regions, involve larger international forces, and test the ideals and resilience of the emerging nation. Yet by 1779, the American Revolution had demonstrated a remarkable capacity for endurance, adaptation, and the pursuit of independence against overwhelming odds. By 1780, the American Revolution had entered a particularly challenging and complex phase. The conflict in the southern colonies intensified. With Britain aiming to capitalize on loyalist support and reassert control over the region. The Southern Campaign tested the flexibility, endurance, and strategic ingenuity of American forces. Unlike previous Northern campaigns, the South demanded unconventional tactics, deep coordination with local militias, and a keen understanding of the terrain. General Nathaniel Greene emerged as a key figure in this theater. Tasked with commanding Continental forces in the southern colonies, Greene adopted a strategy of mobility and attrition, recognizing that his forces were often outnumbered and outgunned by British regulars. Greene avoided large-scale confrontations unless conditions were favorable. Instead, he focused on harassing enemy supply lines, engaging smaller detachments, and drawing the British into prolonged campaigns that exhausted their troops. This approach required patience, discipline, and intimate knowledge of the land, a strategy that ultimately wore down British forces over time. The Southern campaigns also underscored the vital role of local militias. Leaders such as Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, used guerrilla tactics to disrupt British operations. These irregular units leveraged speed, surprise, and knowledge of the terrain to challenge British superiority. Civilians often provided intelligence, shelter, and supplies, further enhancing the effectiveness of American resistance. The Revolution, in the South as elsewhere, was a struggle that relied on the active participation of ordinary people as much as professional armies. Meanwhile, the international dimension of the war continued to expand. France's commitment strengthened, with troops, naval support, and supplies arriving in America. The French fleet disrupted British naval dominance, limiting reinforcements and protecting key American positions. Spain, motivated by its rivalry with Britain, engaged in military operations in the Gulf Coast and provided indirect support to the American cause. The involvement of European powers transformed the revolution into a global conflict, forcing Britain to stretch its resources across multiple continents and theaters of war. Economic and logistical challenges persisted. Inflation, shortages, and disrupted trade made sustaining the army difficult. The Continental Congress struggled to provide consistent funding and supplies, while states competed for scarce resources. Yet adversity also encouraged innovation. Local manufacturing increased, volunteer committees organized supply distribution, and communities developed networks to support soldiers and civilians alike. These efforts demonstrated the adaptability and resilience of the revolutionary movement. The ideological foundation of the revolution remained a driving force. Americans continued to view the war as a struggle for liberty, self-governance, and the protection of natural rights. Leaders emphasized that sacrifices were not temporary hardships but investments in the creation of a free and just society. Pamphlets, newspapers, and public addresses reinforced the moral legitimacy of the revolution, maintaining civilian and military commitment despite setbacks. At the same time, social and political tensions persisted. Loyalist resistance remained significant in certain regions, especially in the South, creating a complex environment of civil conflict alongside the international war. Native American nations facing encroachment on their lands often allied with Britain, further complicating the strategic landscape. Enslaved Africans sought freedom in various ways, sometimes joining British forces, highlighting contradictions between the ideals of liberty and the realities of American society. These complexities shaped military and political decisions, requiring careful navigation by American leaders. By the end of 1780, the American Revolution had become a multifaceted struggle requiring coordination across military, political, social, and international domains. The conflict demanded strategic flexibility, ideological clarity, and sustained popular support. Despite the hardships, the revolution had proven remarkably resilient, maintaining momentum against one of the world's most powerful empires. The combination of leadership, local participation, and international alliances set the stage for the campaigns that would ultimately decide the fate of American independence. The revolution's evolution by 1780 demonstrated a profound truth. Independence was not secured by single victories, but through perseverance, strategic thinking, and the collective will of a people committed to a shared vision. The challenges ahead would be significant, yet the foundations for ultimate success had been firmly established. The year 1781 became pivotal in the American Revolution, as military, political, and international factors converged to bring the conflict toward its decisive phase. The southern theater of war remained critical. British forces, confident in Loyalist support, continued their campaign to dominate the southern colonies, capturing key cities such as Charleston, South Carolina, in 1780. This success, however, was not the end of resistance. Rather, it triggered a persistent and adaptive American response that would ultimately challenge British assumptions about control and loyalty. General Nathaniel Greene's strategy of mobility and attrition intensified in response to the British advance. Greene divided his forces into smaller, agile units that could engage, evade, divided his forces into smaller, agile units that could engage, evade, and harass the enemy while avoiding direct confrontation with superior forces. This approach exhausted the British, disrupted supply lines, and prevented them from consolidating their gains. Over time, Greene's careful planning and understanding of local terrain allowed American forces to regain influence in contested areas and inspire renewed confidence among local populations. Guerrilla tactics by leaders such as Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Daniel Morgan played a decisive role. These irregular forces operated in swamps, forests, and rural communities, targeting British detachments, communication lines, and supply convoys. Their effectiveness forced the British to commit more troops to protect vulnerable areas, diverting resources from other strategic operations. Local militias, supported by civilian intelligence networks, became essential components of the broader revolutionary strategy. The revolution was increasingly defined by flexibility, local initiative, and the engagement of ordinary Americans. International support continued to strengthen. French troops, under the command of generals such as Rochambeau, arrived in greater numbers and coordinated with Washington's forces. The French Navy played a crucial role in challenging British control of the coastline and enabling coordinated offensives. Spain, while not formally allied with the United States, engaged British forces in the Gulf Coast and Florida, further stretching British resources and complicating their strategic planning. The American Revolution had fully become a global contest, forcing Britain to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. Washington, now experienced from years of campaign and adversity, prepared for a bold operation in the Northern Theater. He recognized that decisive action, coordinated with allies, could bring the war toward a resolution. Careful intelligence gathering, coordination with French forces, and disciplined troop movement set the stage for a campaign that would ultimately test the limits of British capacity and resolve. Meanwhile, the ideological core of the revolution remained central. Leaders and civilians alike were reminded that the struggle was not only military but moral and political. Pamphlets, speeches, and letters emphasized the principles of natural rights, self-governance, and liberty, reinforcing the sense of collective purpose that sustained the colonies through years of hardship. Even as battles raged, Americans were conscious that their cause represented a new model of government and society, one based on principles rather than hereditary authority. Economic pressures persisted but were mitigated by local ingenuity. Communities developed systems for supplying armies, producing weapons, and supporting displaced populations. Civilians adapted to shortages through shared resources and innovative production methods. The revolution had become a nationwide effort, integrating the contributions of soldiers, civilians, and foreign allies into a comprehensive struggle for independence. By mid-1781, the conditions were set for a decisive confrontation. British forces were overextended, their southern campaign had provoked widespread resistance, and American forces were increasingly coordinated, trained, and confident. The combination of military innovation, local support, ideological clarity, and international assistance created an environment in which the balance of power was shifting. What had begun as scattered protests and isolated resistance had grown into a resilient, strategically sophisticated movement capable of challenging British dominance. The stage was set for the culminating campaigns that would define the outcome of the American Revolution. The principles that had inspired independence, liberty, self-governance, and collective responsibility remained the guiding force. The forthcoming battles would not only determine military victory, but also solidify the political and ideological foundations of a new nation. The autumn of 1781 marked the culmination of years of strategy, sacrifice, and international coordination in the American Revolution. General George Washington, working closely with French allies under General Rochambeau, initiated a bold campaign in Virginia designed to corner the British Army commanded by General Charles Cornwallis. This operation demonstrated the evolution of American strategy from defensive survival to decisive, coordinated offense, highlighting the maturation of both military and political capabilities. Cornwallis, stationed at Yorktown, had entrenched his forces along the Virginia Peninsula, confident in British naval supremacy and reinforcements from New York. Yet Washington and Rochambeau recognized that control of the Chesapeake Bay by French naval forces could isolate Cornwallis, preventing him from retreating or receiving supplies. The plan relied on precise timing, coordination, and intelligence, an unprecedented level of strategic collaboration for the Continental Army. As American and French forces moved south, they were supported by local militias and civilian networks that provided intelligence, supplies, and logistical assistance. Communities in Virginia and surrounding areas, motivated by ideological commitment and fear of British occupation, played an essential role in sustaining the campaign. The revolution had evolved into a collective endeavor, where victory depended not only on formal armies but on the active participation of ordinary citizens. By late September, the Allied forces had effectively surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse controlled the Chesapeake Bay, cutting off British escape or reinforcement by sea. Washington's troops, combined with French infantry, artillery, and engineers, established siege positions around the British lines. The coordination between land and naval Forces was unprecedented in the war and demonstrated the strategic sophistication the American and French forces had developed. Over years of conflict, the siege intensified through October. Artillery bombardments weakened British fortifications, while continuous pressure from Allied forces reduced Cornwallis's capacity to maneuver. Morale among British troops deteriorated as they realized that escape was unlikely and reinforcements were unavailable. Cornwallis faced the grim reality that surrender was the only option if further casualties were to be avoided. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis formally surrendered to Washington and his allies. More than 7,000 British troops laid down their arms, effectively ending major combat operations in the American colonies. The victory at Yorktown was not merely a military triumph. It symbolized the culmination of strategic persistence, coordination with international allies, and the determination of ordinary Americans to defend the principles of independence. Yorktown also had profound political consequences. The British government, faced with mounting debt, public criticism, and the realization that victory in America was increasingly unlikely, began negotiations to end the war. Diplomats such as Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams engaged in discussions that would eventually lead to the Treaty of Paris. Recognizing American independence and establishing borders for the new nation. The ideological significance of Yorktown cannot be overstated. The revolution had been justified through appeals to natural rights, self-governance, and liberty, and the victory demonstrated that these ideals could be realized through perseverance, unity, and strategic action. The success validated years of hardship, sacrifice, and risk undertaken by soldiers, civilians, and leaders alike. Even as Yorktown marked the end of major hostilities, challenges remained. Establishing a functioning national government, managing debts, and addressing social inequalities were tasks that the new nation would face immediately. Yet the revolution had proven that collective effort, grounded in principles and supported by both local communities and international allies, could succeed against formidable opposition. The surrender at Yorktown thus represents not only a decisive military achievement but the fulfillment of the foundational motivations for the revolution. Independence, once an uncertain goal pursued through protest and conflict, was now an accomplished reality. The war had transformed the colonies into a united nation, capable of self-governance and poised to develop its own identity on the global stage. The aftermath of Yorktown in late 1781 set the stage for a transition from war to nation-building. While major combat had effectively ended, the challenges facing the newly independent United States were immense. The colonies had won independence, but they now faced the difficult task of creating a stable, functioning government, managing finances, and maintaining social cohesion across a vast and diverse territory. The Continental Congress, which had guided the colonies through the Revolution, now grappled with the realities of governance in peacetime. The Articles of Confederation, adopted during the war, provided a framework for union but lacked the authority to enforce taxation, regulate trade, or maintain a standing army. These limitations would soon become apparent as economic instability, internal dissent, and international pressures tested the fragile new nation. Economic recovery became an immediate priority. The war had devastated farmland, disrupted trade, and caused widespread inflation. Many soldiers returned to find their homes damaged or lost, while merchants and artisans struggled to restart businesses in the absence of stable currency. Local governments and private communities played critical roles in rebuilding, distributing food, and restoring infrastructure. The hardships of war had created resilience, but they also highlighted the need for a stronger, coordinated national system to sustain prosperity. Political challenges were equally significant. The 13 states, while united in the fight for independence, retained strong individual identities and priorities. Disputes over borders, trade policies, and representation in a central government required delicate negotiation. The revolution had demonstrated the power of collective action, but it also revealed the difficulty of translating shared ideals into practical governance across a diverse and dispersed population. Social changes from the Revolution continued to shape American society. Women, who had managed households, farms, and businesses during the war, began advocating for greater participation in civic life. Enslaved Africans who had sought freedom during the conflict pressed for emancipation or recognition of their rights. Native American nations, largely excluded from the new political order, faced ongoing displacement and the loss of traditional lands. The revolution's ideals of liberty and equality, though not fully realized, had generated debates that would influence future reforms and policy decisions. International relations remained critical. Britain had recognized the limits of its military strategy in North America, but it remained a global power with interests that could impact the new United States. France, Spain, and the Netherlands, having supported the revolution, now negotiated economic and diplomatic ties with the fledgling nation. Maintaining favorable relations with these powers was essential for trade, security, and political legitimacy. The revolution had been a local struggle, but its outcome placed the United States within a complex global framework. The military lessons of the revolution also endured. Washington's leadership demonstrated the importance of resilience, strategy, and adaptability. Militia and civilian contributions had proven that the support of ordinary people was as decisive as battlefield victories. Guerrilla tactics, coordination with allies, and strategic patience had allowed the Americans to overcome a far more powerful adversary. These lessons would inform future military and political decisions in the new nation. Ideologically, the revolution had established enduring principles. The concepts of natural rights, popular sovereignty, and government accountable to its citizens were no longer theoretical. They had been defended through struggle and sacrifice. While the practical implementation of these ideals remained incomplete, the revolution had proven that collective action could shape the destiny of a people and challenge entrenched authority on a global stage. By 1782 and 1783, the United States was transitioning from wartime exigency to peacetime nationhood. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, formally recognized American independence and established borders, marking the legal conclusion of the revolution. Yet the larger work-building institutions, reconciling differences, and ensuring the revolution's ideals endured was just beginning. The American Revolution had succeeded in defeating British authority, but it now faced the equally complex challenge of creating a functioning, unified and principled nation from 13 disparate colonies. The signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783 marked the official end of the American Revolution, formally recognizing the United States as an independent nation. While this event brought legal closure to the conflict, it also signaled the beginning of a profound and uncertain experiment, the creation of a sovereign state guided by principles of liberty, self-governance, and the rule of law. Victory on the battlefield had been hard-won, but the real challenge now lay in transforming revolutionary ideals into practical governance. The Articles of Confederation, ratified during the war, provided a loose framework for national governance, emphasizing state sovereignty over centralized authority. This system reflected the colonists' deep wariness of concentrated power, informed by their experience under British rule. While the Articles had guided the revolutionary effort, they revealed significant limitations in peacetime, including the inability to levy taxes, regulate interstate commerce, or maintain a standing military. These weaknesses underscored the tension between independence and effective governance. Economic recovery became an immediate priority. The revolution had disrupted trade, destroyed infrastructure, and caused widespread financial instability. Farmers, artisans, and merchants faced shortages, inflation, and the challenge of rebuilding communities that had been ravaged by war. Local governments, civic organizations, and private citizens played crucial roles in restoring economic activity. Their efforts highlighted the essential partnership between ordinary Americans and emerging institutions in sustaining national stability. Social and political change also accelerated. Women who had managed homes, farms, and businesses during the war began advocating for greater recognition of their contributions. Enslaved Africans who had participated in or been affected by the war pressed for freedom and legal acknowledgement of their rights. Native American nations, largely excluded from treaty negotiations, faced continued displacement and the loss of ancestral lands. The revolution had established ideals of liberty and equality, yet their practical implementation remained uneven, sparking debates that would shape the young nation for decades. International diplomacy was another critical concern. France, Spain, and the Netherlands had supported the revolution through military and financial aid, and the United States now needed to navigate relationships with these powers in peacetime. Trade agreements, territorial disputes, and security considerations required careful negotiation. The revolution had transformed the colonies into a nation on the global stage, and sustaining recognition and legitimacy demanded strategic diplomacy. Military lessons remained central to national identity. Washington's leadership, the adaptability of militias, and the cooperation with foreign allies illustrated that success relied on strategy, coordination, and resilience. The American experience demonstrated that collective effort, rather than sheer force, could overcome a vastly superior adversary. These lessons influenced both the development of military doctrine and the broader political philosophy of the new republic. Politically, the revolution had instilled enduring principles. Ideas of natural rights, popular sovereignty, and government accountability were no longer abstract. They had been defended, risked, and realized in practical terms. Citizens understood that governance required participation, vigilance, and compromise. The challenge of transforming revolutionary ideals into effective institutions became the central task of the new era. By the mid-1780s, the United States faced a precarious balance. Independence had been achieved, but the young nation required stability, unity, and workable political structures. The lessons of the revolution: hard-won victories, local engagement, international support, and ideological clarity provided both guidance and inspiration. Americans had proven that a determined people could challenge an empire and secure liberty. Yet the experiment of nationhood demanded sustained effort, ingenuity, and compromise. The American Revolution, from its origins in protest and taxation disputes to the global and transformative conflict it became, had fundamentally reshaped society. It had demonstrated the power of collective action, the importance of principles, and the capacity of ordinary people to influence history. Victory at Yorktown and recognition in Paris were milestones, but the enduring significance of the revolution lay in its ideas, its lessons, and the nation it made possible.